Hey, and welcome to another video in the series of how to start with Monogame. Today we're going to talk about something that I would call a manager. Now, I don't know how often people create these or if it's just me, but I like to put everything in something called manager. Well, not everything perhaps, but things that have one kind of job. I would like to put it in a manager. So what I figure we do today is create something called the input manager. As we can see here, I have already put down in the previous video some is key down and checking some keys. Now I would like to create something that kind of holds this together, and I would like to move this keyboard controls to the sprite in this example. Just basically because I can. If that's the last thing we'll do, like if that's how it's going to be, maybe not the end game, but sort of to practice this managing kind of thing. Also, we could of course keep it in here in the update. We'll get to that part. But so the first thing I want to start off doing is make us capable of binding these keys. So instead of talking about keys, I want to talk about input, sort of what are you actually, like you have a key and when you press it, you actually want some kind of action or something to happen. So I want to create a new class that I shall call input. And it's going to be an enumerable. And we're also going to go into something called flags. Now, this might become a bit kind of technical for some of the viewers, and perhaps you already know about binary operators and stuff. But you could follow along and try to kind of see if you feel like, oh wait, what's that? I'm not going to explain like binary operations in this video. But you could definitely check up binary flags and such if you just Google it. So basically how it works is you want to be able to store different values in just one value. So you kind of flag it. You flag more than one thing in one big value. So we'll say one input could be up. We could call it move up, but you know, we're shortening it. So one input is going up and left and down. Oops, not three. That's my spine typing in things. Right, and we'll have back, which is when we want to back something, or you know, press escape, back out of a menu, perhaps a back button. So I've given these 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. This is part of binary numbers. So basically, let's just leave it at that. This is our input enum, so we can call it input.up, input.left. Next up, I want to create the manager that I've been talking about. So I'll just make a new class. We're going to call it InputManager. First of all, let's make it public and create a constructor. Now, I wanted two things here, or actually three things. I want to create a dictionary, and in this I want to store keys, which is going to be what key we are pressing. Oops, keys, and it doesn't recognize it, so we'll have to do the control period, and it says, oh, using Microsoft XNA framework input, absolutely. And I want this to be translated later into an input, so we're holding in our dictionary kind of a translation, like a key has been pressed, like W perhaps, and it's going to have a value, an input. We call these key bindings keyboard, because in XNA/monogame we have two kinds of inputs. We also have this called buttons, which comes from the gamepad. So I'm going to show that to you as well. Now, usually when you have a keyboard and a gamepad, you could decide if you want to have input from both active at the same time. Should I be able to press up on the gamepad and a button on the keyboard, and it should like input both. And usually you have a setting in your game which says, are you playing with gamepad or with a keyboard? So we're going to do we're going to create a boolean that's called is see, I had a good name, is using keyboard. And that's something we will tell the input manager in the beginning here. It's like bool is using keyboard. Is using keyboard equals to. It's actually, I have this big mic in the way in front of my keyboard, and I apparently am used to watching my hands sometimes. Okay, so but our input manager doesn't do much right now, but we're about to make it do more things. So we create an update method, and in here is where all the magic happens. So I'm going to check a bit, just so I have sort of a plan here. I just want to make sure I don't miss out on things. Yeah, oh yeah, something we could do here is when we create this input manager, we could either kind of read in the key settings from like a save file or something like that, but we're going to keep it a bit simple here. We don't have fancy things like that. So we're going to do this, key bindings keyboard. So this is when we create our input manager. And we could actually do an kind of an if statement, like check if you're using the keyboard. Maybe we don't even load the key bindings gamepad. This isn't like very costly, so we're going to just do it this way. We'll load both and just use whatever, because you might want to change without having to create a new input manager. We might let them set this is using keyboard when you go into settings. So we have this key bindings keyboard, and I'll do the let's see, we had, you know what, this is gonna be a bit of a typey thing, so let's just go to my cheat sheet that I've previously kind of coded here. So the W key will be bound to the input up, left, down, right, etc. And if we press escape, it's our input for backing. And I'll copy paste the key bindings gamepad that I already created, and I'll go through it with you. So in here we instead have a dictionary of buttons, and buttons look like this, D-pad up, but you could check here, it has A, B, left shoulder, left stick, thumbstick down. So you have these typical gamepad buttons. I am myself using this gamepad. Let's see if I can get it into view. So I have one of these kind of Xbox controllers. So I'm going to show you that later, that it kind of works. I haven't actually tested this code, so it's going to be fun if it actually works on the first try. Okay, so now we have some information, basically how we are going to bind the keys, if we're using the keyboard or if we're using the gamepad. So let's see here, in the update, we are going to check if we are using the keyboard. Oops, not us, is using keyboard. Else, we're going to use the gamepad. We could have written it out, but nah, this is how we do it. It's using keyboard. So, now these two things are going to be a bit different, but we're also gonna get into a bit of kind of flag stuff that might be not so like it might be a bit complex for some. But first of all, we need to fetch all the keys that the input we receive from the actual game. So we do a bit of this keyboard get state. Let me check. It takes two things. Yeah, it takes a player index. That's also going to come into kind of a we'll have to, because you can have multiple gamepads in, and you could be player 1, player 2, this is, I think, like old things from Xbox and stuff, so you can make it compatible. I think you still could kind of need to code these things in. Maybe you don't. To be honest, you can code it so it doesn't really matter, but it's capable of handling that in case you need to. So we could say that, well, since we need to check like a certain player index, we could first of all implement the namespace and just go player index, and we'll say player, and we'll give a default like check player 1. So we could say player, so get the state for the player that we are checking, and we'll say get pressed keys. Let me just see, is it... Oh, it actually says it's obsolete. Okay, but it's going to perhaps come into use later. But okay, so for keyboard, of course, it doesn't have multiple players. You don't connect multiple keyboards, but you know, it had an option for it. Okay, so we'll just do it like that. Okay, what's the next step? We're going to for each keys key in pressed. Actually, I'll call it pressed keys. That, by the way, is a very nice handy shortcut in Visual Studio. If you press Ctrl R and then R again without holding Control, you get this nice little rename thing, and it highlights, and you can go in and just edit it out and stuff. It's great. Okay, so now we check through all the pressed keys that comes from the state from the keyboard. So if let me just remember here. Oh yeah, we have to check the key bindings. If the key bindings keyboard contains this key, because you might be pressing L or P or O and it's not here, so we don't want to check that. Then we want to do some, oh yeah, this is where I have missed one thing. We need to create I'm sorry if this is a bit jumpy, but I hope that you're following. So we need to store somewhere what kind of input we've gathered. So we're going to create a player input integer. We'll store all the inputs that we have gathered, all these inputs that have numbers. They have 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. We're going to store whatever you press inside this integer. So in here we'll say player input, and this is a bit of the complex stuff for some of you perhaps. This is basically saying if player input is going to be zeroed out, by the way, every time. Player input equals 0. And if I now do player input, say 15, this is basically going to say player input is now 0 and 15. So if I type like if player input now is 15, or say it's 4 or 5 actually, and I do this, we'll say it's 5 and 15. So it basically binary will add those two numbers together, so you will be able to check, is it 5, is it 15, sort of. But 5 and 15 are pretty bad numbers for binary operations. But what we'll say is this: we'll convert, and I will explain this. Whoops. So from key bindings keyboard key, so we're looking up the value. You pressed something and we're checking it. So you pressed perhaps W, and it's going to say, oh, that's input.up. And we want to throw this into, or cast it into its number. So the number is 1. So we're going to say player input is 0 and 1. And then it checks the next key. Maybe you pressed left as well, and that's 2. So it's going to get input left. It's going to convert it into its number, which is 2. So it's going to say, well, player input is already 1 now, or it's 0, 1, and it's 2. So it's going to say 1 and 2. Basically, player input will be 3 at this point. That's just how binary stuff works. It's going to add the binary indicator for 1 and for 2 together. They make 3. 1 plus 2 equals 3. Okay, so that's actually all we have to do for that part. Now for the gamepad part, it's pretty similar, so I'm going to copy paste this. Again, I basically all coded this in Sublime, or like a notepad kind of program, so I haven't even tested if this code works, so it's going to be kind of interesting to see if it works. Okay, so for gamepad it's a bit different. We don't have get pressed keys in the get state, so, and also you can see here I've utilized that player index, because get state, it does have a get state that doesn't take any, I think. No, it doesn't. No, okay, that's also something. A gamepad definitely needs to be hooked into some kind of player port on the Xbox, etc. So basically you say P player. You say what player? Well, player 1. We could check for all the players if we want to. So gamepad get state player. This gives us a state. So what I do now instead is I go through all the bindings for the gamepad. So I'll only check these buttons. And just check. So we go through them and check. In this state, is button down, is from this state, is button down, and we'll check the first one, D-pad up. And if it gets yes, it'll say, well, add it to the player input. The value, in this case, is perhaps the input up, and we convert it into int. So we're basically doing the same thing as we're doing here. It's just, you don't get pressed keys. You have to actually check, is this key pressed? Yeah. Is this key pressed? No. And so in the end, it creates the entire player input. After this, we want to create a bit of a method that checks if these are pressed. And this is a new thing that I actually haven't done before. We want to create a method that returns a boolean if it's pressed. And I usually don't use params, but it's pretty good in this case, I think. Like, we'll try it out. So we'll call it inputs. So we will ask the input manager if these things are pressed. So what we do here is start off with a number that we can fill up, sort of like we do the player input, and we just do a for each and call it like player input pi, but I'll write it like, well, actually that is we'll say pi in p inputs, and we just basically want to add any input we get from the inputs and check against the player input. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to call this. I'm going to say something like if input manager. Oh, sorry. I'm just going to mute my phone so it doesn't make any kind of noises. That was bad by me. Sorry. Okay. I want to be able to say something like this: pressed input up. That would basically say, is input up pressed? But we can also do, is input and left pressed? It won't say yes if only one of these are pressed, is the idea. We'll see if that works. So here comes a bit more binary magic. Return, and we say the player input, which is the collection of whatever we've pressed before, and n, which is what we're asking for. If this is larger than 0, then we have a match, basically. Okay, I think this input manager is done. It's time to try it out. Just gonna quickly check. Have I forgotten anything that I wanted to cover? I think we're done here. So something I want to make now is an input manager. And we'll just put it here. And when we construct this, we want to do input manager equals new input manager. is using keyboard. Now this could be a setting. You can decide, will it be a setting that's loaded in a settings config file or whatever. And I think, did I skip that? I'm gonna go to input manager. I wanted to do this as well. Is using keyboard true? That's our default value. So we can decide if we here want to give this false or something. But if we just create a new input manager, it's just standard. The good thing about it is then if we want to, we can create input manager as a singleton. I won't cover singleton now, I think. We'll see. Probably not though. Now, input manager has an update function. So we want to constantly update this. So we'll say input manager update. Now, player index 1. We're just going to check player index 1. So we have that as a default. So I'll just call input manager update. And usually, like when I do my input manager, I'll have some timing elements. Like if you press F, you might want it to wait a little while and then repeat the F press every so often. And you could do some timing stuff. If so, you'll have to pass on the game time. But we won't do that now because that comes a bit later, perhaps. So I should be able to do something like this now. Input manager pressed input back. So if this is true, we shall exit. Now previously it said if you press that on the gamepad or on the keyboard, then it backs out. Now we'll basically only have one option, like you can only press back on the keyboard or back on the gamepad. And let's see. I want to kind of keep this, but I want to move it into the sprite, but it's actually not good. I was thinking of putting it into sprite, but sprite is supposed to be used in many different like you can have multiple sprites, and we don't want them all to move when we press up or down, left or right. So I might have to, what you could do is basically say sprite, is this sprite player controlled? Then listen to these things. I guess, you know what, let's do that. I might be backing a bit on myself here, but we could do it like this. We'll say sprite boo is player controlled, and we'll do this. Boo is player controlled, and most sprites won't be player controlled, so we'll set it as false. Oops, I'm all over the place. So, but we have the option now to say if a sprite is player controlled. Now, something I want here is an update function. And usually, we don't have to send this game time, but it's quite often that you have to use it, or you want to do something with something that is time-based. We won't probably use it right now. I'm just gonna kind of prepare for it. So if let's see, is player controlled. So when we update this sprite, we want to check if this is player controlled, then we want to kind of handle all these things. However, we don't have this anymore. And we don't even have the input manager here in this update function. So this is where you get to decide yourself. Either in this update function, you could send in an input manager, because you might have multiple input managers. Or you could, you know that you only want one input manager ever. If that's the case, you can do what I'm going to do now. You can either create a singleton of input manager, or you could make a singleton out of your game. Like both of these things, there will only exist one of. I'm not going to create multiple YouTube game instances. So follow me here. I'm going to do private static YouTube game instance, public static YouTube game instance, get. So if instance equals null, which it will be the first time it's called, return, instance equals new YouTube game and return instance. So whenever we call YouTube game.instance, when we call it the first time, this instance will, we won't have set it, so it will be null. Then we create the YouTube game and put it in here, and then we return it. The next time we call YouTube game instance ever, it won't be null, so it won't create a new YouTube game instance, and it will just return this instance. So we basically say there's only going to be one YouTube game. It's going to be in this YouTube game instance. This also means that I'll show you like this instead. So right now from here I would say YouTube game instance dot, and I'll not be able to see my input manager here, input manager, and we're going to fix that. But something we also have to fix at the same time, sorry for being jumpy, is if we go into the program, we create an instance of the YouTube game here. This is just something you'll have to kind of do when you create a singleton out of the YouTube game. So what we want to do is, instead of creating this, we just want to say YouTube game instance run. So basically, as soon as our program is running, we will call this YouTube game instance. It will say, oh, I need to fetch this instance, and it'll go here, create it, and call it to run. And from then on, every time we call YouTube game instance, there will already be an instance for us to call. But yeah, as we checked here, even if I do YouTube game instance, there's still no input manager here. So we have to go to our YouTube game here, and we'll actually just have to make a public input manager. Now, I'm not sure it's good coding practice to call like a field the same as a class, but it actually kind of works. At least it does for me. You'll have to feel it out for yourself. So I'm basically just saying, you know, anyone can access this input manager from the YouTube game instance, but only through read. Like, you can only read it, you can't set it. And what we give them is the input manager that we can fully play around with in this class. So now if I type input manager, nice, we can get a hold of it. So now typing all this stuff constantly is quite a long, you know, it's very like, I don't like to do that myself. We could basically do this. W is up, so pressed input dot up, and this absolutely works. So S is down, down, A is left, and T is right. And as we can see, we still have a bit of a problem here, but luckily I had already thought of making that game time before, so it's basically just, it needs to read from this game time parameter that we sent in. And tiny male sprite, well, we're in the sprite that we are trying to control, so we can basically say this dot position y, but we don't have to say this dot position y because we don't have to position in this scope, so we'll just say the short version. So basically, when we update this sprite, if it is player controlled, we check the input manager. Is input up pressed? Oh, it is. Then this position of this sprite will increase or decrease, etc. Now we still have a few things to do. It's turning out into quite a long video. I was thinking this will go so fast, but no. So this tiny male sprite, we can now say is player controlled. We have to say true here, else it will default to false because we want most sprites to be non-player controlled. But this of course means in the update function we have to call the tiny male sprite dot update and give it the game time. So first of all, and this is important, the order is important. We first check, InputManager should probably be checked first, or one of the absolute first, because we want to check, okay, so what buttons do we have pressed? Okay, we have these buttons pressed, and then we could do some fancy stuff like exiting if something is pressed. Quite also prioritize that, you know, instead of moving a character before, if someone wants to back out of the game, you know, that happens first. And then we want to update this tiny mail sprite. And another kind of manager, and we might get to that later, is a sprite manager that could control and hold all these sprites for us. And we could just say, you know, sprite manager update, and it would update all these sprites for us. But right now we only have one, so it's kind of okay, easy to do this. So I think, let's see if I've forgotten anything. I think this should be it though. So if I now, and this is the moment of truth, I press F5 and I press the buttons and it actually works. Oh yeah, and we have a bit slower movement up down. We set that previous time. It actually works. I haven't even tried this code, so I'm quite happy. So let's first of all, let's go 30 on all of these. But then we have one more thing to try, and let's hope that works as well, which is keyboard. Oh yeah, by the way, I was thinking of, actually I'm going to show that again, but I'm going to show it with no board. No board is pretty good. So now you can see me pressing D button down here and WASD. So this works. And something you could do, also pressing escape works. I don't have escape mapped on no board. But something you could do is, funnily enough, let's see, sprite. Let's say, how could we do this? Just to show you one of the perks of doing it like this. I'll take away all this code, so right now it won't move at all. And I'll say, since we gave these params, we'll say if input up, down, input left, input right, YouTube game instance exit. So if we hold up, down, left, right at the same time, we should exit. We don't even have to put this code here in the sprite. I just did it. You could put it here in the here where we actually escape the game as well. You know, actually, let's do that. I'm being a bit. The character will move while we do this, but you know, it's not the end of the world. Could also be demonstrating. So basically, then we don't have to actually call the. We'll just say InputManager pressed. If we press all these, exit. Let's see if this works. I press right. Oh. So it didn't. Let's check. Let's see. It. Let's just check here. It might be me thinking wrong here. Oh yeah. We'll do a conditional breakpoint if n is bigger than 0. So we don't want it to. Oh wait, what input does it have? Up. Oh, but wait, just give me a slight moment. I'm just gonna try to figure this out. So it didn't work the first time, I'll give you that, but be right back. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, first of all, my breakpoint condition was set false. I checked n. I should have checked player input. I was confused why it was actually catching that, but now I know that. And this, of course, what we are checking here, see, I'm even confusing my binary operations and stuff. What we're checking here is if any of the things we check for is pressed, then it would trigger. So it's sort of an or, became an or statement. So what you could do instead, if you want it to work the way I want it to work, is say if player input equals to n. So they are the same thing. So if pressed and you say up, left, down, right, then it needs to match that exactly. So if you press up, left, down, right, and the key, like a P or something, or if you press W, A, S, and not D, and you want to check W and A or something like that, if it doesn't match exactly, then it wouldn't return true. Maybe not like the best, maybe you don't have any kind of use case for this. It could be like, well, if you press Control K, I want to check that or something. But what if you press Control K and Y? What should it check for? So now it should kind of work. Let's hope. So first of all, it still works with the WASD. But now if I press all of them together, it exits. So got it to work. If it's good or not, I don't know. But what I was thinking it could do is first check if input up and left is pressed. It checks that first. Then move diagonally and then skip the rest of the input code. So it doesn't, you know, move you 10 up and 10 left. Instead, it moves you 8 up and left. I am sorry, this way. So could be used like that. But usually you would just check 1. And for that, it works as well. So if we do this, now I just have to press escape. Last little showcase is just the thing I was going to show you. Not this, the input manager. And say, is keyboard used? False. Now I don't have no board for gamepads. So I'll have to try to get this on and show you up, down, right. So you can move the... Actually, I notice now, if I press diagonal on the gamepad, it doesn't register as up and down. You can't, and on a gamepad you can't press both at the same time. It probably actually is a separate thing, like diagonal. So you would have to check for that. Things you could probably, but you can go up, down, left, right. And of course you probably want to use the, what are these called? Analog sticks. And of course I don't. And if I press back here, back, ooh, it closes. So that works. I think that'll be it for this one. Sorry, quite a long one. I usually have many kind of ideas and like you might want to do this, and you can of course, I mean it just shows you that you can do things a lot different, like in a lot of different ways. You could make this input manager work like this instance, and you could have only one input manager. Now I can have multiple if I want to. So maybe one checks player 1 and one checks player 2, or you call the update multiple times, or you can do it in many different ways. This is how we solved it for this little project at least. So if you would like to, I would love some feedback down in the comments section below, and rate the video if you want to. And please consider subscribing if you aren't already. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.